As is our custom, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer this morning. So I would ask if Mr. O'Connor Connolly to offer a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love and for your mercies, which are new every morning. We pray that you would now guide our thoughts as we deliberate and consider the matter that's on the agenda for Finance Committee, that in so doing, first and foremost, your name would be exalted, but that we would do what's best for the interests of our people. Continue to guide, help, and direct, in particular with the chairman, as he chairs this important meeting. For these mercies and favors we ask in Jesus' name with thanksgiving. Amen.
Amen. Please be seated.
No, sir. There's some confusion.
Good morning, members of the committee. We do have a quorum for this morning's meeting of Finance Committee, and so we may proceed to deal with the business at hand. The purpose of this morning's meeting is to consider the item shown on the hard copy of the material that has been distributed to all members and was tabled in the House earlier yesterday. The committee's approval for this supplementary expenditure is being sought under Section 12 of the Public Management and Finance Law. Such a procedure, honourable members will recall, was last done in April. Our intention is to conclude Finance Committee proceedings today, and so I ask for everyone's cooperation to allow us to have the report and the minutes prepared and to have them approved and to reconvene the Legislative Assembly again to table this report this afternoon. When it comes to taking the vote on the single item on our agenda, I'm going to ask members' position by posing the questions. All in favour of supplementary expenditure with respect to TP60, housing assistance for an amount of $1.2 million being approved pursuant to Section 12 of the PMFL, please say aye, and those against, no. Now, members will quite rightly ask, what is the financial impact of the request that we are considering today? The request before us this morning is $1.2 million. And in terms of revisions to or projections for the financial year, it is still expected that there will be a sizable operating surplus of some $66 million for central government for the current financial year that will end on the 31st of December 2019. That there will be cash balances of approximately $362 million, and that amount will be approximately 180 days of expenditure coverage, which would be significantly in excess of the requirements of the fiscal framework for fiscal responsibility. Net debt ratio that is anticipated to be substantially under the ceiling of 80%. And so, honourable members, I can say that none of the FFR ratios that government must satisfy are in any danger of being compromised or non-compliant because of the approval of the supplementary expenditure request that is now before this committee.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chairman.
Member for Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those of us on the back bench don't have the requisite documents which you suggested were handed out yesterday.
Okay. They were sent out. No, the document was tabled yesterday in the House. Yeah. Wednesday. Sorry, my apologies. I tabled it on Wednesday. Everyone now have a copy of the request? Okay. So we will proceed to consider the item that is before us. And before we actually begin to take questions and examine it, this item, I would ask the Honourable Premier, do you have any remarks that you would like to make at this time before we commence with the Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak to the proposed supplementary appropriations for the 2019 financial year, which are being sought in this meeting of Finance Committee. Mr. Chairman, the Ministry of Community Affairs seeks approval of an increase in funding of $1.2 million in accordance with Section 12 of the Public Management and Finance Law. As the Speaker, Mr. Chairman, and members of this Honourable House may be aware, during the 2015-2016 financial year, the government allocated funds for housing repairs to the former Ministry of Community Affairs, Youth and Sports to establish a housing repairs assistance program. The purpose of the Housing Repair and Assistance Program is to make repairs and improvements to address health and safety issues at the applicant's property. Priority is given to eligible Caymanians who are elderly, 60 years of age and older, and are permanently disabled as determined by a licensed medical practitioner in the Cayman Islands. The service is also open to families on a case-by-case basis, especially those with young children who do not have the financial means, as determined by the Needs Assessment Unit, to carry out essential repairs to their homes in cases where the safety and well-being of their children may be at risk, and in cases where persons have legal responsibility for children in need, as determined by the Department of Children and Family Services. Priority is also determined by an applicant's individual factors, which include income, health, age, disability, and a number of children in the household, as well as property factors including status of interior accommodations, environmental, electrical, plumbing, roofing, and exterior hazards. Mr. Chairman, so far in 2019, the Housing Repair and Assistance Program has nearly completed 7 repair projects, and in a moment I will provide honorable members with a historical overview of the HRA's, the Housing and Repair Assistance Program's achievements to date, which should address a parliamentary question posed to me by the elected member for Georgetown Central, which has not yet been answered. However, Mr. Chairman, for the express purpose of explaining the current need for this supplementary appropriation, I note that the Ministry of Community Affairs advised the Cabinet that there is a real and immediate need for additional funding to be allocated to TP 60 housing repairs to address 22 priority projects left outstanding due to insufficient funding from this financial year, as well as prior financial years. Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, if such need is approached in a piecemeal manner, projects left unaddressed will deteriorate even further, thereby heightening health and safety concerns of the unaddressed projects, which will consequently be even more expensive to repair the longer they are left unaddressed. Mr. Chairman, therefore, our unity government has therefore listened to these concerns and resolved to take comprehensive action by approving this supplementary appropriation of $1.2 million, which is the sum recommended by the ministry, to address all 22 priority pending projects on file with the Housing Repairs and Assistance Program, assuming unforeseen repairs are at a minimum. Mr. Chairman, this is yet another clear example of how our unity government is able to remain resolute in its efforts to assist and care for vulnerable members of society, especially older persons, children, and youth, persons with disabilities or who are otherwise vulnerable. And importantly, Mr. Chairman, how our unity government is able to put surplus funding derived from a strong economy and prudent fiscal management to work for our people. Mr. Chairman, in response to the latter half of the parliamentary question posed to me by the elected member for Georgetown Central concerning housing repair assistance, the tally of houses repaired since the establishment of the Housing Repair and Assistance Program by district is as follows. I should say, parenthetically, Mr. Chairman, that by district, I say by district rather than by constituency, because the Housing Repair and Assistance Program was created prior to the introduction of single-member constituencies and thus tracks projects by district, the original electoral districts that we are familiar with. However, if the elected member for Georgetown Central still considers it necessary to receive a constituency breakdown, I will instruct the ministry to prepare the same and provide it to the elected member for Georgetown Central as soon as possible. The completed Housing Repair and Assistance Project district breakdown is as follows. Completed, these are the ones that are completed, not the ones that are on the way. 7 in West Bay, 12 in Georgetown, 7 in Bordentown, 6 in Northside, and 4 in East End. I should say that there is a separate program in existence for Cayman Brac, and those are therefore not covered either in this vote or in what I am saying. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence and thank the Ministry as well as the Housing Repair and Assistance Program Oversight Committee, staff and contractors most of whom are small construction firms, for the invaluable time and efforts with respect to housing repair assistance for the less fortunate. And Mr. Chairman, I also wish to particularly thank Mr. Andre Ebanks, who has been chairing this important housing repair and assistance committee over the course of the past year or so, and his predecessor in that post. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Premier. Are there any questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Member from East End.
thank you. Good morning. Mr. Chairman, I thank the Premier for that very comprehensive update on what has been done thus far. I think it is prudent to say that it is appropriate to say that we support the assistance to elderly, particularly with their homes. We all do. I believe that I can safely say that every member of this Honorable House does, and sees that expenditure as one that is worthy. I wonder if the Premier can then give us, in addition to those that were completed, the ones that are still outstanding, and I guess by districts that he has said it's not broken down by constituencies. But that would be fine, I think, if we even get them by districts.
Premier.
That's if they don't have it by constituency. Yes, the 22 priority projects. Certainly, Mr. Chairman, the Premier should know that I know we're not going to call names nor properties in here.
West Bay, there are 7. Georgetown, 5. Bordentown, 2. East End, 5. And Northside, 3. 7, 5 is 12, 14, 19. Yeah.
Member for East End.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to hog this up, but the others are there. And I know the Premier wouldn't know anything about this, but our good friend, Mr. Ebanks, is very knowledgeable of a particular one in East End where we were. We determined that it had to be totally rebuilt. Is that one on this list, or do I have to make a representation on that?
I don't know about particular projects, and I'm not going into particular projects. Mr. Chairman, I'm not briefed on particular projects, and I'm not going into them. If the leader of the opposition or any other member wants particular details about a specific project, they can speak to the chairman of the HRA offline. I don't think it is appropriate for those sorts of details to be disclosed in Finance Committee.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the Premier, but I wasn't asking for any names or anything. It's just that Mr. Ebanks knows. I can talk to Mr. Ebanks off mic.
Other questions? Member for who's next? Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to say thank you to the ministry and the chief officer, as well as to Mr. Andre Ebanks for their commitment and hard work so far. But I also want to accept the request by the Honorable Premier to have a breakdown by constituency. That being said, the Premier just said that the extra monies are for the 22 outstanding planned applications, but said he doesn't foresee any more extras, or that should cover it if there's no unforeseen emergencies or applications. So is the 1.2 for those 22 applications? Is the 1.2 specific for those 22 applications?
Yes, it is important to note that the entire budget, which was approved by this Legislative Assembly for this financial year, and I mean this financial year, that is January 1st to 2019, has already been exhausted. So these are the additional projects which have been determined by the HRA and the ministry as priority that we are seeking additional funding for. This is not just a lump sum that is being appropriated for whatever, for general use. These are for specific priority projects. I should say to the committee, Finance Committee, that the original, in fact, the criteria which exists limits expenditure to $25,000 per project. And the only how the committee can go above that is with the approval of the minister, who happens to be me. And the vast majority of these projects are well in excess of $25,000. In fact, they're generally between $40,000 and $70,000. But it is what it is. There's no point in saying it's limited to $25,000 and you can't get the job done properly. You might as well not start it in most instances. So that's where we're at. That's why the money's disappeared so quickly.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I want to thank the Premier for that answer, because based on my calculations, that's an average of $54,000 per project, and that's a substantial amount of money. And like you said, these are 22 applications that have been approved so far. Can the minister say, based on his technocrats, whether there is foreseen outstanding applications that may potentially, by the time this is used up, you're back here asking for more? Because I know that there is the difficulties of deciding who can get based on the ownerships of the properties, because there's many people that we would agree that are in need but don't qualify because of the technicalities of the policy if you don't own the property and the like. So the question is, this allocation will cover this 22. Do we foresee that we will be back here potentially by next year asking for another lump sum of money?
Mr. Chairman, we've adopted a 2-year budget cycle. So we're in the second year of the 2018-2019 budget approval. So a new budget will come to the House in late October, early November to cover budget years 2020 and 2021. So the answer is yes, but there'll be a new budget to cover that. Budget allocation to cover that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you again, can the minister say if they're having any difficulties with persons who were asking for help, but because of the structure of the policy requirements in order to be approved, because of the structure of the policy in order for you to be approved, that persons are being denied? And if so, what range of persons out there that, say for example, who live on a family lot? The property is not in that person's name, but have been living there for the last 30 years. Technically speaking, they cannot get the assistance from government in any way. But we still recognize as a department, they need help, but we can't give it to them because the policy doesn't allow. Can you give an indication to what amount is there out there?
I don't know if we can, if we're able to do that. The thing is, Mr. Chairman, you have to be so careful that this is not abused. Government can't go down the road of repairing houses for landlords who then rent them. So if there is a case where people have lived, for generations in a house, but they don't actually own it, from my perspective, I would certainly be prepared to give the necessary political directive that that property gets repaired once their satisfactory investigation has been made about the state of affairs there. So I don't think that we should try to broaden the scope of the criteria really, because it truly is open to abuse. And we see today the kind of money that is being proposed. $70,000, you can almost build a house in some instances. So we have to be very, very careful and scrutinize these very carefully, because like any other program, it is open to abuse if you don't manage it very carefully.
Member from North Side.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, can I ask the Minister, I have in my possession two documents, the Need Assessment Unit Eligibility Criteria, Housing Repair Assistance Program, Housing Repairs Assistance Funding Agreement. Can the Minister confirm that, I got these over a year ago, confirm that people to whom we give this assistance are signing this funding agreement?
Yes, I'm so advised, Mr. Chairman.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I understand that there's either 9 or 10, and is it 22? Or, because the paper, the finance paper says 23 that we're doing.
22 is the number that.
But I understand that there are 9 or 10 additional projects which are already approved by the committee, but this money will not fund those. And I fully understand the rules, that I am not in a position to increase anything. But I was wondering, given the chairman's announcement that we have.
Mr. Chairman, before the member goes there, I've just been advised that that's not the case. This 22 covers all of those.
That covers all that are currently approved by the committee.
Chairman, it might be more helpful if I ask the chairman to respond, because I have to keep referring to him.
Can I ask you to state your name and position before you proceed to answer the question?
Sure.
Thank you.
Andre E. Banks, Deputy Chief Officer, and also the Chair of the Housing Repair Committee. Mr. Chair, through you, the projects that I believe the member of Northside is referring to are those for which the budget has already been exhausted. So the committee approved those in advance, and the budget has already been exhausted to complete those projects, most of which have been wrapped up. So there isn't anything pending before the committee because there isn't any money left. So once the funding is approved, then these priority projects will then be approved by the committee. But what has happened is that the individual ministry team has identified, based on the criteria, that these are the priority cases. But nothing is outstanding in terms of I think the group that you're referring to.
Are there any other applications before the needs assessment unit that may come up to the board that you're aware of at this time?
I'm not aware, but I'm pretty sure if I had to guess that there would be applicants. It doesn't arise to even the ministry team yet until the person has passed through NEU's eligibility criteria. So those wouldn't arise to the Housing Repair Committee program as yet. Just
to continue then, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if the government would be mindful to take $1 million out of the surplus declared by the chairman at the beginning and add to this figure, because these are genuine needs. And what we're up against here is that we're going to address this 22 that are there, but I am sure there are others where the need is just as great, but we will not be able to address them during this financial year. They would have to wait for budgeting, and someone might be dead by then. Oh, well, that commitment would be okay for me.
That's okay.
Down west.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, my questions would have been how much were pending and if this was sufficient and if we consider increasing it, but the member for Northside already dealt with it, so thank you.
Member for Cayman Brack.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Having listened to the response, Mr. Chair, I have a couple queries as they relate to Cayman Brack. The description says housing repairs assistance to Caymanian persons, which obviously, for all intents and purposes, would include Cayman Brack. No, I know. And I was about to go on to say that there is, I understand, $180,000 and a separate program for Cayman Brack, which I would assume that's being administered by district admin. And I'm also made to understand that the applicants in Cayman Brack are only receiving $10,000 per project, whereas if they were included in the definition of Caymanian, based on what I heard this morning, they could be eligible for $40,000 to $70,000 per project. So is there any appetite for that program to be a part of this program? It seems to be a much more positive and beneficial program. And the need on the Brack is equally as great.
Mr. Chairman, I think we need to have a discussion about that in caucus, because I know the view of the Deputy Premier was quite adamantly that Cayman Brack should have a separate program, which is why it has been treated this way for all of this time. But I think we should have that discussion in caucus rather than in Finance Committee.
That's fine, Mr. Chair. Once the understanding is with the Deputy Premier and all others that the member from Cayman Brack East would have an equal say, because I really think that with my constituents hearing how much the people in Grand Cayman are making for urgent needs, which I fully support, that it's going to be difficult going home this afternoon with them hearing that and not having any justification. So that's why I was asking to perhaps widen the definition. We can have a separate program on the Brack if that's what my colleague wants. I'm just trying to make some part and act as some. I'm happy to discuss it in caucus, but I thought that I should use this opportunity to raise it as it's new information to me.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, member for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Premier said to earlier question that he would be amenable to, I think, in the cases where the people would know it afterwards, to try and help some repairs there when they're in need. I wonder if the government would be amenable to what used to happen years ago was when the government assists people, they would commit to the government own that property upon their passing. I saw a number of those from Mr. Warren that his father had gotten them to commit to. In the interest of, once the repairs are done, you know, and or rebuild or whatever, in the interest of the social services, it could be used after the passing of that, the demise of that person, for housing, for government. Would the government be amenable to that?
Mr. Chairman, over the many years I've been around this, that's easier said than done. Most of these situations, I mean, what we would like to be able to do is to have, at a minimum, the consent of the registered owner of the property before we enter onto the property to do anything to it. But in many instances, families have lived there for generations, and the mother, let's use an example that I am aware of. The grandmother has passed on. Her estate has not been properly administered. The property remains in the name of the grandmother, even though she's been dead for 40 years. And there is really no one person you can go to who has the legal authority to sign anything. So I do appreciate what the leader of the opposition is trying to do to give government some basis and some return on this. Where that is possible, I would certainly recommend that that's what government does. But in most instances that I know, it's not quite so simple.
Mr. Chairman, I totally agree with the Premier, but in the case that I know, and I had discussed briefly with Mr. Ebanks some time ago, we're talking about somebody who is owner, very capable of making those decisions. They have already discussed it with their children, and they have both agreed, and they are now they are prepared to do that, to pass it, to sign an agreement with government, build a little house, and then the property is probably quarter acre, the usual size, and pass it over to government.
But Mr. Chairman, in sort of one-off cases, we're prepared to look at that, but the government took a conscious decision. We want to assist people to get their houses up in order, not to wind up in a situation where they either have to pay the money back or have to give us the house. That's not what this program is about. If there are special cases where the sort of proposal leader opposition just made is something that the owner wants, then perhaps we can look at that on a sort of different
Member for
arrangement. Yeah.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, can the Premier give an indication whether that kind of program would fall under this, or if he said it wouldn't, but where would consider something like that being done? Because I think it's a lovely idea. I'm glad to hear that the Premier is willing and open-minded to that. But for myself, as a new beginner in the opposition, if I wanted to bring a suggestion like that to government to consider so we can vote on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, where would you prefer that program to be started at? What ministry and under what kind of scenario?
That ball just got bowled at me, so I would need to think about it a little while. But I have to be very careful about how we go about that. As I say, that the objective is not, and I don't think the objective ever ought to be, about government taking houses from families because we've done that, right? So we have in place a long-standing housing trust that builds houses, that has a structure for people to own places, right? It may well be through there, but I really, because I've seen this before, and because we have had a number of instances where we now have or have had persons begging for forgiveness of this arrangement, the children wanting it, and government, we have to make these decisions in cabinet as whether to forgive this particular debt. I just don't think that is a wise move. It is very difficult politically, and I'm being absolutely frank, to take something from a Caymanian, even if their parents signed some document or not. So I rather not go down that road unless it's a very, very special and clear case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We even had one instance out here in town where and this goes back many, many years, where the old lady was adamant that she wanted to give this house to government because government had been looking after her for many years. We still in a battle some 15 plus years with some nephew, not even because she didn't have any children, who says this is wrong for government to take this. The woman didn't know what she was doing when she entered into it. This is a messy kind of situation, which I think government should try to avoid.
Mr. Chair, just have one follow-up if possible. I know there's other members who want to ask, but I'm aware that the Deputy Chief Officer, Mr. Ebanks, had ventured on some travels to see how similar programs like this in respect to housing assistance has been done. And I'm aware of some of those locations that he traveled to do programs similar to this. Would the minister be willing to allow the Deputy Chief Officer to give us an overview of kind of some of the programs they looked at while they were overseas and other jurisdictions to give us an idea of what we could consider here in the Cayman Islands?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, with your permission.
Through you, Mr. Chair, those housing programs that we were researching were in relation to persons who are not homeowners. So persons who need to rely on government for housing because they don't have property. That's quite different than this case where you have people who are homeowners but can't afford the repairs. But in that type of research, the housing and repairs came up anecdotally in those conversations, and programs were quite similar to what we do here. In fact, I was going to make this point to support what the Premier has just said. Other jurisdictions are moving away from putting liens on properties because they're finding it very, very difficult for the government to enforce that. And what the line of thinking seems to be is to try to have prevention rather than cure, is to do as much investigation and due diligence as you can to ensure that you're dealing with the right folks who are in absolute need, rather than to try and enforce a lien, which seems to be really, really difficult and challenging for any government to try to truly enforce.
Mr. Chair, I did put one other question through the minister before that I didn't get an answer to, and I think it was just by mistake. But I know that the Deputy Chief Officer would probably have the best information in respect to this. Based on the applications, do you think there's a large amount outstanding that we can have an anticipation or an idea of how serious is this problem? Because we're only talking about the ones that are approved here. But I know you would probably know how many applications have been in over the last year or a couple of years.
Okay, I think this may have been what also the member of Northside was attempting to ask, but probably didn't phrase the question in a way that conveyed, I think, what he was seeking to ascertain. The board of the committee approves cases that have already been vetted and that we have identified. We've done our due diligence checks, we've identified the needs, and we've identified the homes. So there are cases that have been bulked by the group, by the committee, to say that these are the absolute priority based on the person's health, age, circumstances, or finances, and that's what these 22 represent. There are others that we consider important, but not necessarily high priority, where it's a life-threatening risk. So the 22 are identified as those that really cannot wait. We're talking about danger that could happen tomorrow. There are others where there are leaks and repairs that, if left unchecked, could arise to the level of the 22 that this funding would not cover. So if that's what the member of Northside was seeking to ascertain, that hasn't been approved by the committee yet because there's no funding. But if there were greater funding, there are more that could be approved, but they're not as urgent as the 22. There are at least, in total, 36. 36 36 in total. So 22 out of 36 are covered here, and then that's the balance, the difference between the two. Now, they're not, as I said, in in sort of informal jargon in the ministry, the ones that you're dealing with now, we consider screaming urgent, that they just cannot wait.
Mr. Chair,
Would like to acknowledge the member for Northside and give him a chance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because I really wasn't finished in the first go-round. But anyway, the way that I think to address the thing of ownership with senior citizens, maybe the Premier might want to discuss in his caucus with the Minister of Housing, having the Housing Trust introduce reverse mortgages, where they could go and build somebody a house and it works as a reverse mortgage. It's a total legal entity. It's very popular in some other countries at this stage, which could address that issue. The question I have is, how much detailed inspection goes on before these houses are, and the level of repair and stuff is done and agreed to?
Through you, Mr. Chair, very detailed. So the person's financial, so there's two halves. The person's, or the applicant's financial state of affairs is vetted by NEU. The person's property is vetted by our housing repair manager, whose ex-planning department, who goes through and inspects the homes to make sure and does a measured survey of exactly what is wrong. So it supports earlier comments of the Premier, whereas our people are prideful. If you were to drive past a home on the road, you might query, why is government fixing this home? Because it looks fine from the outside. But isn't until you go to a detailed view of the house, you actually see that there's mold, the roof is leaking, and so that way, if you were to only repair the leak, you have not cured the mold that the person is breathing in night after night. So you do have to expand the scope of works to actually truly address the root problem in the house that is causing the life-threatening scenario.
And the overriding criteria is health, safety, and the general environment.
Health, safety.
Are there any cases where the family get involved in doing additional repairs in separate negotiation with the contractor while the contractor is on site doing the government work?
And in certain cases, that does happen.
Member for Georgetown Central.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, can I, if the member don't mind, I just want to say.
Go ahead, Premier.
No, not over the mic. I just turn the mic. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to advise the committee of what our little discussion was. So there are 36 instances that we are aware of, and this is the 22 priority. Based on my discussions with the chairman, the average cost of repairing those other 14 is about $30,000. That's the average cost. So we are estimating quickly here that would be an additional $350,000. And then we'd cover all that were actually in train. So I am going to Yes, Mr. Chairman, the arithmetic was bad. It's 420. So I am going to move, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, at the appropriate time, that we increase this 1.2 by 420, and then we'll cover all of those that are currently in train. Right. So we'll wrap them up in this appropriation, with obviously with the approval of the committee.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the Premier took away my question, because that's what I was going to ask the government to consider, but he rightfully covered it. So that's good. That's good news. Yeah, he's a mind reader. But the Premier did say that he was open-minded to solutions. I wonder if the government would consider, particularly for those awkward situations whereby a Caymanian may be living on somebody else's property, that if the government would be willing to accept maybe that property owner giving a written permission to say, I will allow that person to live there, for example, the next 20 years, would the government accept those types of scenarios to assist those families who live on property that is not their own, to get over some of the hurdles of Caymanians living in those kinds of conditions?
Mr. Chairman, as I indicated earlier, we do have that flexibility. I mean, it's all on the minister's head, and they will insist, that is the bureaucrats, the technocrats, that the minister signed that he's approved this particular case. But that goes with the responsibility of being a minister. You have to make these judgments. So we do cover those cases. I don't know if anyone's going to agree in writing to let somebody stay on it for 20 years, but we would look at the history and how long the people have been there and that sort of thing. Because what we don't want is we fix the place up, they kick the person out and they sell it, or rent it to somebody else, right? So one has to have proper investigations done, look at the social circumstances, look at the family circumstances, and then make a judgment.
Are there other questions? If not, then Premier, we'll ask you if you would proceed now to making your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move under Standing Order 65 that the appropriation sought of $1.2 million for housing assistance to the Ministry of Community Affairs under TP60 be increased from 1.2 million to 1,620,000. $1,620,000.
That's the right amount. All those in favor of increasing TP60 by $420,000 to $1,620,000 pursuant to Section 12 of the Public Management and Finance Law, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, no. The ayes have it. I then put the question formally that all those in favor of an additional $1,620,000 of expenditure being occurred in the 2019 financial year with respect to TP60 housing assistance being approved pursuant to Section 12.2 of the Public Management and Finance Law, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a division, please?
Madam Clerk.
Honourable Alden McLaughlin,
Aye.
Mrs. Moses Kirkernel, Honourable Moses Kirkernel, Honourable Juliana Connolly,
Abstain.
Honourable Dwayne Seymour,
Aye.
Honorable Joseph Hugh,
Aye.
Honorable Tara Rivers,
Aye.
Honorable McKeeva Bush,
Aye.
Honorable Barney Bush, Captain Eugene Ebanks,
Aye.
Ms. Barbara Connolly,
Aye.
Mr. David White,
Aye.
Mr. Austin Harris,
Aye.
Honorable Arden McLean,
Aye.
Mr. Alvis Aku,
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan,
Aye.
Mr. Anthony Eden, Mr. Christopher Saunders,
Abstain.
Mr. Ezra Miller,
Aye.
The results of the division are 14 ayes, 2 abstentions, and 2 absentees. The motion, therefore, is carried. Members of the committee, I'm going to suspend proceedings in Finance Committee, and we will recommence in the large committee room of the House to consider the report and the minutes at 2 o'clock. So that'll give us time now to break for lunch, and the clerk and the staff of the LA to prepare the reports. We reconvene at 2 p.m. in the large committee room. Thank you all.
Before you take the vote, that gives us, what, 2.5, 3 hours? Yes, Mr. Chairman, but this is a very one-item agenda. Sorry? No, they can't take long, so I would certainly say that we should be back here in the House by 1 o'clock. Given that members had indicated that they had other agendas that needed to be taken care of today, 1 o'clock.
Okay, we will reconvene at 1 p.m. in the large committee room. Thank you.